Hey everybody, today I want to talk about the new neuroscience of learning, some updates to theory on how to optimize education so it's really human-centered based in neurodevelopmental knowledge. Traditionally, we think about emotions and relationships as being completely separate from learning, like keep your emotions out of it, right? But when we look in the brain, we see that's not actually the case. We have all of these processes related to emotional and relationship activities, and we have all of these processes related to thinking and higher cognition, and there's tremendous overlap between the two. So you really can't have one without the other. We think with our gut. It's an essential part of us, an essential part of learning. But education is traditionally considered that we're like filling up an empty vessel, like we're just dumping into information in and giving instruction in to someone who's just waiting there empty to receive it. In neuroscience, we call this the brain in a bucket theory, which is funny. I learned about this from Professor Kurt Fisher in my first day. I think it was the second class of the Mind, Brain, Health, and Education course he taught at Harvard. And he had this picture very similar to this with this bucket. And it's like people have been thinking that the brain is completely separate from the body. Like what you do to the body doesn't affect the brain, and what you do to the brain doesn't affect the body. But it's the opposite of what's true. This brain in the bucket theory is not accurate. We need to think about humans from a different holistic perspective. The brain is part of our body, and it doesn't work well if our biological needs aren't met. Our goal then, and here this is from Dr. Maria Montessori, is to understand the laws of development and act accordingly. And she said over 100 years ago, we need to find out that the laws of life are such and such. They cannot be ignored. You must act in conformity with them, for they proclaim the rights of humans, which are universal and common to all. So she laid down her prescription for what we needed to do if we really wanted to serve humans in supporting their development. Luckily, neuroscience has discovered many laws of development, and I like to just nod to Mary Helen Imordino-Yang here from University of Southern California. She has the Candle Center for Affective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education there. Wonderful resources if you want to go deeper into this. She's a leader in the field of human development and education that can be rooted in neurodevelopment. So some of those laws can be grouped into 5 key potentials. The top 5 emergent developmental potentials are that, we'll go in reverse order. Learning is dynamic and context dependent. It's experience dependent. It's seeking meaning and purpose. It's embedded in culture, and it's embodied. We become what we learn, and we'll go through each of these in this talk. This is really similar to Dr. Montessori's theory about nebulae and emerging potentials of the human, that we're not predefined at birth, we create ourselves. And this is also closely connected with the theories of human tendencies developed by Montessorians. And just think about these for a quick minute before we go deeper, that we teach best by encouraging each human's innate drives, that humans have these innate drives or tendencies to be in relationships, including communicating, imitating, being independent and self-sufficient with other people, responding to others with compassion or stress, controlling ourselves physically, intellectually, emotionally. We have a tendency to learn, a drive to learn, explore, move, repeat, be precise, establish and discover order, concentrate, and realize perfection, control our errors, and improve ourselves. And also to have meaning and purposeful work. Now, these human tendencies are expressed to different degrees in different people at different times. You might find in yourself that you're really in a gregarious state. You're very focused on relationships. Or as we get older, we may be more and more focused on order. And, your mom goes crazy if you put her keys in the wrong place. It freaks her out. Those are our tendencies that are more pronounced or less pronounced across time and also differently from person to person over time. Okay, let's go through each of these emergent developmental potentials, starting with number 5, that development is dynamic and context dependent. Let me break this down a little bit. There is not one path to learning, and context is everything. So here we have our start, our beginning and our end, but look at all the different ways that you can get there. You don't just go straight. You can go up and down. You can go down, up, down, up, down, up. Many different ways to get there. And the context around how we're learning matters a great deal. We learn in predictable patterns where we make progress. Our learning falls apart. We reconstruct it. We make progress, falls apart, reconstruct it, and so on until we master something. Let me get into more detail on this. First of all, we develop along different developmental paths. This image is from research by Fisher and Yan, and it's looking at how you develop literacy, writing, a great writing ability. Look at all the different steps that might be involved in different people's paths. Some people might need to interact with friends, play board games, resolve conflict, argue persuasively. Others are going to be writing paragraphs. They're going to be doing workbooks. They're going to be answering prompts. There's many different ways that we can build the skills and capacities that we need to reach the finish line, to reach the goal. Our capacities don't develop in isolation. There are many roads to mastery, and I want to tell you this story about Robbie. Robbie was a student in my class. He was 6 years old and had been in my class for 3 years, but he couldn't read. All he wanted to do was look at books about animals and draw pictures of animals. So I invited him to start copying down the names of his favorite animals. And on this particular day, he was looking to find animals that had the CH phonogram in them. That's the little green sandpaper ch phonogram there. And he found this picture of an Australian lizard called a chuckwalla. So he went to the office, he made a copy of it, and he decided he was going to embellish that copy and focus in on that. Well, of course, this was interesting to two other students in the class who could already read. And they'd been reading for 6 months for one of them and a year for the other. But they were still interested in Robbie and the work that he was doing. So all of a sudden, Robbie had this relationship going on. This continued for many, many weeks of Robbie just looking for animals, writing them down, making copies, drawing, until all of a sudden, Robbie started reading. Finally, after 3 years of work in the classroom, following all the required, prerequisite lessons and activities, but it was this something shifted in him when he was able to express himself about animals and with relationships with others. Now, that's not the typical path that you might see. The two children next to him, they followed more possibility one on the slide. They had spoken language lessons and lots of relationships and practice speaking. They did their sandpaper letters to learn letter sound knowledge, and they did that with friends and alone. They did a lot of writing work with movable alphabets alone and with friends. They did phonetic reading work with friends and alone, and they did handwriting with friends and alone. But Robbie, his process was a little different. He was mostly independent, not as social. He did spoken language lessons with teachers. He did sandpaper letter work, letter sound knowledge work. He did movable alphabet, mostly alone. But he didn't next go to reading. Instead, he went to handwriting, and that was where relationships came in, and then he started reading. So there's not one path for every student to follow. We need to open our eyes and be flexible to look at the true variability of the human in front of us. Variability is our strength, and it's predictable and reliable. Brains are like faces. No two are exactly alike. Because this variability is everywhere, we really need to honor it. It's not problematic that there are different paths for everybody. It's normal. And so we have to preserve the intellectual health and the intellectual safety of the learning environment so that this variability is allowed to be what it is. We can pretend it's not there, but it just is what it is. So if we can really focus on the safety component, that it's okay to be who you are, it's going to help with learning, it's going to help with development and well-being, and it's a human-centered approach. Okay, learning develops dynamically over time, and forgetting is predictable. So let's say you're listening to this talk, okay? And later tonight, you are talking to your friend about it, and they're like, what'd you do today? Like, oh, I listened to this talk on the new Neuroscience of Learning. You're like, what was it about? Oh, it was something about the brain. It was good. Something about the brain. Okay, so you're right up here at the top of this first hump in learning, okay, when you're here now. But when you go home tonight, it fell apart. You're down here. Now, let's say tomorrow you look at the slides again, or you read another article. Boom, your knowledge is going to get increased and get bumped up to that second hump. You're going to forget some of it. It's going to fall apart. You're going to review, have a scaffold of support. Something's going to remind you of something. Your knowledge will increase, fall apart, increase. This is a predictable pattern that will happen over time. These dips and rises, dips, rise, dips, rise on the road to mastery. Now, if we observe students in our classes, we're noticing this, and we tend to think that they're really on that high level all the time, and we may not notice the errors as much, or we may hyper focus on the errors, but there's this variable road that's happening on this upward path as they make progress. But when we give standardized tests or certain tests that are out of context, we may see a much lower performance level. That's because those scaffolds, those supports, those reminders, the context has been taken away. And this is important for us to think of when we're considering assessments. If we have to prepare students for assessments, then we need to give them those practice assessments in the environment that they'll be given so that they can learn how to take their knowledge and translate it into the assessment so that their knowledge, their capacity can be accurately recorded. And we can remember that these setbacks are predictable and we don't have to freak out when the student's like, oh, they totally forgot that. Just do it again. Give them a little support, do it again until they're good on their own. So mistakes are predictable, and learning how to work with them in a supportive way can be really helpful, which means we want to nurture an optimism bias, a strengths-based focus. It can be really helpful for us. Now, we have a negativity bias, it's true, and this negativity bias evolutionarily has been very helpful for us in keeping us alive and helping us survive. You know, like the first time you see a tiger, you run away and get away. The next time you see a tiger, you stay farther away. You know, you don't want to die. And so negativity, scary, stay away. That's helpful, okay, for survival when we were earlier in our evolutionary state, or if we're in really difficult states. That's very helpful. In typical states, we don't need that, and it's actually not going to help us thrive as much, and it doesn't help our students thrive as much. So we and our colleagues, so we're trying to develop the ability to focus on strengths more than weaknesses, and to use those strengths to overcome weaknesses. We don't pretend the weaknesses don't exist, but we use strengths as our tool to get around and overcome our challenges, okay? We're biased to notice these negative things because they may be important to surviving, but they may not be as helpful for thriving. So this is a nice little activity you can do with a friend or on your own. Think of someone you know, a student or a colleague that you work with who's easy to work with, okay? And list 5 of their strengths. And then think of somebody, a student or someone you work with, someone in your family who is hard to work with, and list 5 of their strengths. This is a very difficult activity to do. When I'm mentoring teachers, usually oftentimes they want me to focus in on this child who's like, you know, making them crazy. They don't understand how to help the child. And the first thing I ask is, okay, when we're talking later after we observe, what are this child's strengths? And 95% of the time, the teachers say, oh, that's a really good question. And it's a challenge for them to actually put that into words. So do this exercise. It's really, really helpful. Pause it and do it now. Okay, so that's what we've focused on first. The 5th emergent developing potential is that we're dynamic. Learning is dynamic and context dependent. We have a range of development, okay? All right, number 4, our learning is experience dependent. It's called adaptive epigenesis. Now you can impress your friends with that word. This is new vocabulary if it is. Adaptive epigenesis. Okay, don't be so impressed. What it means is that we have fewer genes than most plants and about the same number of genes as a goldfish. Okay, easy to be humble before the child when we think of this. Fewer genes than a plant. Okay, but we've transferred the work of some of those genes to experience dependent learning. So we don't need the extra genes anymore. Instead, we need experiences to teach ourselves things that instincts used to do for us. This is called epigenetics. It's when our genes turn on and off based on our experience and our environment. Okay, so the experience of this child being nurtured and breastfed here with great nutrition and love and attention is physically changing which genes are active in his body in a positive way. He'll have a healthier life with more well-being because of this wonderful nurturing interaction. Now, here's an example of epigenetics that you might not expect. This is a picture of an identical twin, And I'll show you his twin in a moment, who had an epigenetic insult during his life. Something went awry in his development. I think it was a vitamin deficiency. And so you can see the differences that something environmental can cause. Boom. Even in an identical twin, same genes, but they're turned on and off differently based on the input that they get from the environment. So development is driven by epigenetics, okay? It's not predetermined. Our present and future abilities, our capacities, are built from our past experiences, but unpredictably so, okay? We adapt as we just respond to new things based on our past, and that changes our future. Now, here's a story I want to tell you about Zeke. Zeke was a boy in my class, 3 years old. He came in, and all he wanted to do was go up. We had a little loft for resting in our room. All he wanted to do was go up there and suck his thumb. He was just up there sucking his thumb all day long. I'd greet him in the morning and he'd say, "Good morning," go up, lie down and suck his thumb. He would watch everything that was happening in the classroom, but I couldn't get him to do much. Weeks passed and I'm really starting to worry, right? So I talk with his mom and I'm like, I'm worried. He won't come down and interact. He just likes to watch and suck his thumb. And, she goes, "Well, what does your teaching, your training say that you should do for that?" And I'm like, "Well, I should follow the child. I should be patient. I should keep trying to invite him in and be patient." She goes, "Why don't you do that?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll do that." So I did. Thank goodness for parents who support their teachers. So I did that. Sure enough, a couple more weeks go by. Zeke doesn't go up to the loft one day. Instead, he goes right into the math area and he pulls out the work you see there, the cards and counters. This is a work that I would never give to a 3-year-old because there's like 50 works you got to give them before they get there. You got to give them all the sensorial preparation, the red rods, the number rods, the sandpaper numbers, spindle boxes, everything, okay? He comes down, he takes it out, he does it perfectly. Perfectly. I'm not going to interrupt him. He's doing a great job. He changed his developmental path. At first, he prioritized safety and observation, and then he was able to change that into action and application once he felt ready and he felt he had the lay of the land. So every human really is developing differently and they're changing the course of their development. If I had forced him to stay down, I may have caused a lot of stress and it may have delayed his development later on. I'm very fortunate the parents were so supportive. Thank you. So, okay, our brains are changing across our lifespan. We know this based on our genetics, our choices, and our environment. It's obvious when you think of the size of the brain. There's the baby brain on the left and an adult brain on the right. Very big. They're changing, they're growing based on what's happening in our lives. Practicing an instrument changes your brain. Practicing mindfulness changes the brain. And this is just from only 11 hours of mindfulness practices. I just want to say, adopt a mindfulness practice if you don't right now, because this white matter protection is huge protection against dementia later in life. So mindfulness physically changes the brain. Becoming a parent changes the brain. We already knew that, right? But now there's evidence, you can see it. And it's different the way it changes in men versus women. Going to a Montessori school changes the brain. This wonderful story, this wonderful research by Zanchi and Denervaux and other colleagues, they looked at the brains of students who went to traditional school and students who went to Montessori school, and they could see consistent differences, significant differences in brain development based on the type of schooling that they had. So how we live, how we teach, how we approach each day, it physically changes our brain and it changes our future. So we're constructing ourselves in context based on our interests. Learning is not isolated by an academic area, and the people, the events, the environments, our choices, they're all influencing our embodiment, our epigenetics, the way our genes express themselves. Now, I have a little video to show you from Libertas Montessori School in Memphis, a wonderful school, public school, where these children are reading together. And notice what they're interested in. Notice that they're not interrupted. They're allowed to make mistakes and they can move past them. And that is so important because we're shaping our brain's reading networks based on our experiences reading with partners, enjoying a text, accessing useful information, and subjectively interpreting the written word. So take a minute to watch this. I think you'll really find it powerful.
Can. Pat can. Scrub. and plaid and planned. Now we have to. No, the down letter. Oh yeah. Okay. In think. It's time to get to the running part. Ooh. She's jogging. She looks crazy. They both have the same mouths open. And they got the ribbons. You get the same with her. This is hard. Pat can run fast. So easy. Look, it's a baby. What? That's a band, but he's doing whatever that is, and he's jumping. Yeah. That's what it looks like at the break. Yeah, it does look like the same thing. I want you. Pat can sing song.
I have to give you a little background to this. The boy in this video actually wasn't very interested in reading, but he was interested in working with the girl. They had a relationship, and it was that relationship that got him moving forward with his reading and kept him going. A lot of times we see that, don't we? That the children working together will inspire one children, kind of lift them up towards something they weren't heading towards, but they're scaffolding each other in relationship to do more challenging work and to gain more from the work, noticing the connections, ability to move past mistakes that didn't stop them from understanding what was happening in the text. And it's very much about choice where their interest lies. And the interest in relationship is what encouraged them to read in this example. So a child's choices, whether they decide to study music or gymnastics or nature, it's going to change their brain. How do we bring that into the classroom so each child's interest can become part of the academic work that we want them to focus on? A family's choice to live here or there, eat this or that, also changes their brain and their health and even their IQ. Things like iodine intake, physical activity, parental occupation and education, malnutrition, lead exposure, educational interventions and curriculum, living in an urban, racially segregated, disadvantaged neighborhood. These can all change our brain, our health, and our IQ. Even the food we serve at school, lunch changes our brains. And if you have a lunch that looks like this is from my son's public school, I suggest that you might want to have organized with your PTO or something, take a parent to lunch day at your school so we can raise awareness about this ridiculous food and get some proper nutrition in there because it's changing their brains. We are self-constructing throughout our lives. Montessori said the mind is made by the work of the hands. And in neuroscience, we say we repeat what interests us, and repetition sculpts the brain. Just by living, we're growing connections. Now, you probably remember these are neurons in the brain. These little black circles are the cell bodies or the soma. The long skinny lines are the axons, and the short skinny lines are the dendrites. So the lines are the connections. So when we're first born, very sparse connections. But as we grow a lot of connections. You can see there's not really more neurons, not more black dots, but a lot more connections. We overpopulate our connections based on everything we're taking in, everything taken in. So when we get maximum thickness in a cortical area, it's actually really jumbled and it's slow for us to process and get through because there's not a clear path to get anyway. But the brain prunes away what it doesn't use to make those pathways more efficient. And here's an example. You can see that sparse connectivity at birth, crowded at age 7, less crowded, pruned and refined at age 15. And different parts of the brain develop at different times. So you'll see this process occur differently in different parts of the brain. But remember, the brain gets more efficient at anything we do repeatedly because repetition drives that pruning process. We create our physical bodies, our cells, based on how we act, think, and respond. We become what we choose. So if you get stressed out and you're like, okay, I'm gonna do a little breathing and meditate, or make sure I get my yoga in, that's good, or I'm just gonna realize I need a lot of chocolate, I need a big dessert. Whichever you choose, your brain is gonna get very efficient at choosing that. Every time you feel stressed, you're gonna react and respond to go to that mode of activity. So be mindful of what mode of activity you're repeating and choosing. It's going to be hard if you're already all about the dessert, right? It's going to be hard when you first start to make a change and try to breathe instead. But it'll get easier over time because repetition sculpts the brain. When we're inefficient, we have a heavy cognitive load. Okay, it's harder to do it. Here's an example from language. This is language areas used during reading. In an 11-year-old, all those maroon and gold areas are parts of the brain that are active when an 11-year-old is reading. Now I'm going to show you the brain of a 38-year-old. Think to yourself, what parts of the brain do you think are active when they're reading? More or less, same places, different places? Look at this. They're using hardly any of the same real estate they used to use. And we think of 11-year-olds as pretty solid readers, but they're still learning. And when we're learning, we need a lot of our brain's resources to do the one thing we're doing. Once we're masters of it, it's hardly any effort at all. It's easy for us. So remember that when the child is learning, when our students are learning, we need patience and they need time so they can become masters. And it takes years for many things. But the brain finds learning rewarding, and the brain is seeking rewards. This is why we like to scroll through kitten videos. Maybe you don't, but I know some people who do. Scrolling through kitten, dog, right? It's rewarding to the brain, and the brain wants rewards. Here's the brain's reward system. Dopamine, boom, gets released into all these learning areas. So we're seeking that. The brain wants to feel good. It wants rewards. We are driven to learn about what interests us. So we're seeking these rewards, and interest guides us to those rewards. Dr. Montessori said this method, or her son, said this method depends not only on the child, but also on the teacher's ability to stimulate interest. It's very much about finding how we can engage our students in the work that we have available. This is why our classrooms need to be these beautiful, enticing, reliable places full of magic. I love to use cloth pouches to hold card activity materials. You can change the materials in the pouches every few weeks. So they come in the morning, you're like, good morning, there's something new in the orange vocabulary card pouch. I think you're gonna love it. It's magical. They go, boom, they run right over, they wanna see, right? It's magical, but there's a sense of order and beauty in the environment. We need to be creative in finding ways to connect them with the work. We're just like, oh, I just love this. Oh, I just love this artwork. Oh, I wish I had a minute to do it. Hope you get to it. Anything we can do to entice them to get engaged with the activities we prepared for them. This wonderful little video is an example of how the environment really invites the children to get engaged with different work. Now you can see these letters on the little molding on the walls there. It doesn't have to be kept in alphabetical order, but sometimes the children will do that. They'll put it in order. Sometimes they'll even write words with it. This is just one example I'll show you of how focused they can be on something that seems so tiny to us. But see what great work is happening here. You can almost see things building in their brain as they do this.
See how much bigger those beads are than the others? Okay. So look for the 9 again. Okay, now count them.
Oh, this one's super wet. Hey, feel this. This one's super wet.
Even though everything else is going on in the class, the children are very intent on what they're doing. They're noticing order. They effortlessly come in to slide that letter over to make space. They're working together silently with focus. You can hear bells going on. You can hear the teacher giving a lesson. This is just showing us this human tendency to focus and concentrate and achieve order in our environment. When we set up our environment so the students are invited to engage, they get more opportunities to express those human tendencies. So the prepared environment also includes invisible order like routines and cultural responses. So every day we really want to structure our day similarly because we start to rely on that. The brain likes to predict, and we get comfort from things being some predictable. It can still be exciting, but predictable is good for the brain. It likes it. Routine teaching, it teaches skillful habits of daily living and thinking. And our routines will respect the reality of daily life. They're going to allow us to be slow, deliberate, and exact when we need to. And they're going to encourage us to be fully present with whatever we turn our attention to. So this is where we get the most opportunity to apply the art and finesse of teaching, where we can adapt our routines to meet the needs of the humans that we're working with. So here's a quiz. Let's see if this is all making sense so far. If you go home tonight and you can't remember anything about what you learned in this video, it's too late for you to internalize all you learned. True or false? The answer is false. Skills develop dynamically over time with practice. Knowledge predictably falls apart and then is reconstructed to make it stronger. Okay, here's another quiz. It requires more brain energy for a child to tie their shoes than for an adult. True or false? The answer is true. Remember, they have these crowded webs of connections. It takes a long time to get from point A to point B. This is why it takes children forever to do everything. We need patience. Okay, but for us, it's easy. Next question. Some people don't know how to focus on the positive. True or false? The answer is true, but they can learn. We all adapt to our culture, and that includes us. We can learn. Oh, last question. Scrolling through kitten videos on your phone is good for the brain. True or false? It's a joke. It's kind of both, right? You do get a little dopamine, but get off your phone. Okay, it's just a joke. Okay, that is what we have to present so far on experience-dependent learning. Remember that word, adaptive epigenesis. Our environment changes our genes change our environment, change how we interact with the environment. We prune what we don't use, right? Repetition sculpts the brain. And when we're learning, we have a heavy cognitive load. Okay, the next key developmental potential is that we seek meaning and purpose. Individually and as groups, we work to make sense and find meaning in our lives. Each human and group has a unique potential and a drive to affect positive change. Finding purpose strengthens our brain. And here's a great quote. Let me read it to you. Development and learning depend less on their starting point than on their inclination to think and feel deeply about complex issues, to build personally relevant connections, and to find purpose and inspiration in their lives. So we have this thinking and feeling deeply, we have building personally relevant connections, we have finding purpose, and you put that all together and you're building a robust brain. Let me give you an example of the research that they used to come up with this from Gottlieb and Embodiment Yang. So our patterns of thinking actually predict our brain's growth and robustness. In this research study, they interviewed teens after watching compelling videos about adolescents in unique circumstances around the world. For example, a girl in Afghanistan who wanted to become a doctor but had to stop going to school when the Taliban took over. And you can see in that picture, a lot of women in Afghanistan are being trained in domestic production services. They can't do what they used to do. So the teens would see these videos, and it wasn't just about Afghanistan, it was about immigration, it was about all kinds of different things. And they would comment on what they saw. And they did this inside the scanner and outside the scanner, so they could see what was happening in their brain as they did all these comments, and they related the two. The comments are rated as either being transcendent or concrete. A transcendent comment was one that reflected analysis, morality, systems level thinking, big implications, character. And here's an example. I also find it unfair that the people get undocumented. It's kind of weird how it's like a label, how like just because you're from some place, you can't do certain things in another place. So that was labeled a transcendent response, big picture thinking. A concrete response would just be reactive, concrete restatement of facts, like, I'm glad it all worked out. Very short, right? Statement of fact. What they discovered when they looked at the brain images of these teens is that the students who made transcendent responses, they had more robust brain development 2 years later they repeated the study at point A, and then 2 years later they repeated it, they can see it was predicted based on what transcendent comments they made at point A, how their brain would development would go at point B 2 years later. And a key thing they found in this particular study was that transcendent thinking was associated with thicker, more robust development in areas that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, with PTSD. So you might be protecting yourself against developing PTSD if you can develop this type of transcendent thinking. That research still needs to be done, but I'm feeling like it's going to happen. So remember, we are educating for a larger purpose. The larger purpose actually is peace. War is illogical, okay? Education should no longer be mostly imparting of knowledge, but must take a new path, seeking the release of human potentialities. And there she's saying potentialities, just like neuroscience is saying, emerging, developing potentials. We want to cultivate social classrooms, contexts conducive to vibrant intellectual and civic wrestling with complex, relevant issues. We don't want passive people. We want engaged, intelligent people who are courageous, who are able to wrestle with the big questions, speak up for themselves, and consider other ideas so we can come up with the best solutions. All right, meaning and purpose, okay? That's what we just covered. Robust brain development when we think deeply about what we're learning and what we're experiencing in the world. Number 2, learning is embedded in culture and relationships. We have agency and we're adapting to our world based on our time, our place, and our people. We adapt to fit in. So if I am a European American woman, if I were born in Asia, I would grow up and adapt to the Asian culture. I wouldn't have the American culture. My brain would look different because of that. Our learning and self-construction is intertwined with the expectations and norms of those around us. Everyone in the community affects a student's capacity to learn. Everyone in the building, everyone in the community. So we all need to work together as the adults, the leaders, to really set down a culture of strengths-based growth. So Dr. Montessori said this, culture leads us to develop specific potentials. The child is genetically coded only with potentials or nebula, not specific behavior patterns. The nebula lead us to adopt or create our own behavior patterns based on the culture in which we live. Our brain physically changes to be like the people around us. And you can see, I love these pictures. You have this happy fashion family, right? You have the austere royal family, strict but cheerful. Then you have the kind of loosey, farmer family, right? Very different cultures within each family. The humans in those families will develop differently because of it. Their brains will look different. The child reproduces in himself as if by a form of psychic mimesis, like a copy machine, the characteristics of the people in his environment. Now, mirror neurons are kind of one way that this happens. Mirror neurons are things in our brain that make us experience to a lesser degree what we perceive that other people are experiencing. And let me tell you the story of how this was discovered. A researcher was working with a monkey. The monkey had a little cap in his head. The researcher was trying to get some data. And he's looking at the data. He's not getting what he wants. He's getting a little frustrated. So the researcher stops, takes a break, eats some peanuts. He's eating peanuts. Okay. The monkey wants a peanut. So the monkey's going like, hey, give me peanut, right? And so what happens? The researcher, big smart researcher, don't be so impressed, sticks out his tongue at the monkey like this. Okay. So what does the monkey do? The monkey sticks his tongue out back at the researcher. And when they did that, they saw that the areas in the monkey's brain that were active when he saw the researcher stick out his tongue, and when the monkey stuck out his own tongue, were the same areas. The same parts of the brain, whether they did it himself or he saw someone else, he perceived that someone else did it. Is that terrifying? So our brain is getting activated by what we perceive the people around us are experiencing. And this has huge implications for media, of course, and what children are being exposed to, what all humans are being exposed to. But I can put it in simple terms. Think about it this way. Somebody in the next room opens a bag of potato chips, right? You can hear it. You can't see it, but you hear it. They start eating or crunching those potato chips. What happens in you? You're like, your mouth is watering, your head is potato chipping. You're like, it's like you're eating potato chips. You can't even see them. They're in the other room. That's your mirror neurons working. So our choice of words, our behavior dramatically affects those around us. We absorb and are physically changed by cultural norms, whether we stand close, whether we stand far apart, or whether we look eye in eye, or whether we defer our glance. Living in a culture changes our brains. So in this example, you can see from Hans' research, the yellow and orange areas in this picture here, right, and in these pictures here, are showing you areas that are more active in young adults who were raised in East Asia as compared with those raised in Western cultures. But the blue areas are showing you the reversed, more active in young adults raised in the West, in these blue areas. Physical changes you can see in the brain because of where you are raised. So our physiology changes based on who we're around. Our body's turning our genes on and off. Hormones that turn genes on that increase neuroplasticity, which we want for learning, are released when an individual feels safe, socially connected, and agentic, meaning they feel they have the ability to do things. They have self-agency, self-capacity. Okay, so you feel safe, you get hormone release, your genes, good genes get activated, it increases your ability to learn. This is why we need safe, supportive learning environments. It's physiological, it's hormone release, it's changing our genes. Now, when we're calm, this frontal part of our brain is generally in charge, okay? The prefrontal lobe, executive functions, right? Generally, most of our thinking is there, okay? You need the whole brain to do anything, but there's kind of a focus up here. It's regulating the rest of the brain. Now, let's say someone comes in and they tell you you messed up. They're like, hey, what did you do? You totally messed up. What happened? You're like, you jump, right? That's the feeling of the brain activity leaving. I don't know if it's really the feeling. I think it's the feeling of the brain activity leaving the front of your brain and going down into your limbic system, okay, your fight or flight area. And they physically see this on MRI and scans in this Arnsten research. They data to support this. That's what happened. Acute stress moves our brain activity to our emergency response system. So then what happens if they say, now you're going to fix it? Well, you can't get, you're not using your frontal lobe. You're just like, something comes out of your mouth. Who knows what it is? Okay, not teachable moment. So when we correct, when people get stressed out, it's not a teachable moment. Wait, let that pass, redirect, do anything else, wash the dishes, sweep the floor, whatever, let time pass, your body settles, regulates, then at a neutral moment, you can talk about whatever needs to be learned in that moment, okay? And we also want to try not to trigger those acute stress responses because it really gets in the way of learning. So less correction and more inspiration, okay? Redirection and repetition. Because if we're always stressed, we exhaust our brain. Our allostatic load, our brain is predicting what it's going to need to be doing to keep itself going well and everything running smoothly. And if it has regular experiences of stress, it's getting always prepared for stress. It needs to use a lot of resources so it can be ready for what it thinks is going to happen. This exhausts the brain. We don't want to do that. We want those capacities for skillful learning, for well-being, for knowledge growth. Okay, so what soothes stress? When you get these stress things, there's a few tips and tricks. Immediately, things that help are things like physical activity, physical affection, right? Creative expression or imagination, like art or journaling, singing. Sleep, if it's effortless, like not in the middle of class, right? But if it's effortless, sleeping can help. If you're struggling to fall asleep, that's not going to decrease your stress. Slow, deep breathing. And music, active listening, engaging with music. For long-term remedies, while you're doing these immediate things in the moment, you also want to start implementing some long-term strategies like clinical support or therapy. If that's, I like behavioral therapy has evidence to support it. Many other therapies don't, and they can actually cause harm. So be mindful if you choose that path of what you choose. Mindfulness definitely helps. Having good routines for the stressful parts of days, especially like bedtimes and meals when you're with children or families. And sharing the burden of life, processing together. Okay, so we talked about learning being embedded in culture, and relationships, right? We adapt to our time, place, and group, and we perceive our own brain experiences what we perceive other people experience. Now we're up to number one, the big overriding law of nurturing developmental potentials. It's embodiment. Now, what does this mean? We've been talking all about how when we do things in the world, when things happen to us, our brain physically changes. That's called embodiment. Something happens here, and then there's a physical change in us. We've embodied it. Okay, it's not a foo-foo term. It's just we physically change because of the experience. All right, we're living dynamic systems with agency. We get to make choices in how we act or how we think. Sometimes we don't have a lot of choices. We're in a strict environment, but how we respond, that is a choice. We can repattern that if we're in an unskillful pattern, or we can try to develop skillful ones. Our body and our mind are interdependent, okay? We choose, we change, and we embody. And how it works. All through our life, it works like that. And embodiment synchronizes and integrates the brain and the body. Now, there's three possible ways they're guessing that embodiment happens. I'm just gonna, you can go totally geeking out and read this paper by Engel and colleagues, but I'll just give you the big picture. One is oscillatory synchrony. Now, this is wicked geeky. So in your brain, you're oscillating. There's always things. That's what they mean by alpha waves, beta waves, gamma waves. It's different frequencies, rate of how the electrical energy is moving in our brain. And there's this oscillation that's happening. Everything's oscillating around us. We don't know how we know this. We can't I don't have an oscillator to measure, your oscillation rate. But if somebody walks into the room and I don't even see them and they're in a wicked bad mood, you know how you can kind of feel that before you even see them? I think that's related to oscillation, but there's no data to support that. That's just my guess. Okay, so oscillatory synchrony is one way we may be embodying this. Multisensory integration is another way we may be embodying physically all of our senses coming together to ingrain things in our systems, our internal systems. Or predictive coding. Again, that's the brain's always making predictions on what's going to happen next so it can be prepared. And so we may be making these predictions, and that's helping us embody. So embodiment, again, is the overriding law. Okay, you are what you do and what you think. We choose, we change, we embody. So back to those human tendencies, you can see how all of this comes together, right? We are being in relationships, learning, having meaningful and purposeful work. That's a human-centered education. It allows humans to do what they're naturally driven to do, what their bodies are craving, and what, when we support, really supports health, well-being, intelligence, and wisdom. Dr. Montessori recognized relationships, love is essential. Is it not a characteristic of love, that sensibility that enables a child to see what others do not see, that collects details that others do not perceive, and appreciates special qualities, which are, as it were, hidden, and which only love can discover? You see that with children. They see love everywhere. They look at people, someone you hate, and they look at them and they're like, oh, you're lovely. They see goodness that adults sometimes, we get a little obscured from that, and we can gain some personal joy, particularly, and wonder from seeing how children engage with others. And Dr. Montessori described this in terms of love. And in neuroscience, we know that love engages our brain, whether we love a romantic partner, our parents, a friend, or a dog. We're all engaging our brain in different ways. I just want to leave you with this idea about the brain can overcome. This is a picture of a patient who had part of her left brain removed when she was 4 because she had severe illness. And if she didn't have it removed, she would die. They had to remove part of her brain. They said she would never read because that's a part of the brain that's really intrinsically involved in reading. But what do you think happened as she grew? She decided she wanted to read. Her interests were supported. And at age 11, she just used the other side of the brain to read. She flipped her hemispheres. That's the power of the brain. We are not predetermined. Our epigenetics are influencing our development. The people around us are influencing our physical development. And when we inspire people, we can persist them to find their interests and to overcome their obstacles. So I would suggest you pause for a moment. I'm not quite finished, but pause for a moment and write down your key takeaways. We call it a 3-2-1. 3 things you didn't know before you started watching this, 2 things you'd like to learn more about, and 1 SMART goal you have based on what was learned. Think about 1 thing you could do this week, that specific thing that you could measure that you're actually going to accomplish, that there's an action you're going to take to do it. It's realistic, and you're going to get it done this week, maybe Tuesday at 3. Okay? Take a moment to pause and write that down. Okay, I just want to finish up by saying guiding humans is a learning process. So try to cultivate a friendly attitude towards error. You don't know what you're going to get, and it usually doesn't go the way you plan. It's not predictable, but you'll get there in the end. Fortunately, we have a secret weapon. It's the Montessori method, also called the scientific method. And my company has a lot of free resources to help. So please get into our blogs and our about pages to learn more. Also, you can follow us on all these great social media channels. And if you're interested in research and you want to support the work of researchers who are trying to learn more about supporting human-centered education, please scan this code. Please go and sign up for the Montessori Research Pool. Okay, if you sign up, a researcher may contact you to participate in studies about Montessori education. It doesn't mean you're gonna be in a study if you sign up. It just means you'll be in the pool. A researcher will have to get ethics board approval before they can access your name. If they're approved, then they can look, and if you meet their criteria, they might contact you. Please sign up. We need more good research in the field. And I just want to show you references. I actually didn't make any of this up. And thank you very much for listening. I hope it was useful. Have a great day.